Okay everyone, welcome back to the pre-training content series. We know how this works, so we're just going to dive straight in. Today we're going to be talking about how to lift consistently. So we've touched on the 4 laws of training, consistency being the first law and the most important variable, not only with regards to things like exercise adherence, but also the refining of motor skills and ultimately optimizing your performance. It's essential that we get this right straight out of the gate, because ultimately we want to create habits for long-term success. We want to make sure that we're not having to undo things further down the line, and consistency is a huge element of that. So one of the things we need to be clear on is strength is ultimately a skill. Like any skill, it requires practice. And as the old adage goes, practice makes perfect. We know now that that's not necessarily the case. Perfect practice makes perfect. So just to use a really quick analogy for this, you may be familiar with the 10,000 hour rule. We know that that's not necessarily the most accurate method of establishing mastery within any kind of exercise that you do. A really simple example. Imagine you're learning how to drive within golf, okay? You're at a driving range and every single time you hit a ball, it goes out into the pitch black. You can't see anything, you have no idea where the ball goes. There is no vision and no feedback given about where the ball is going. You're never going to improve because you ultimately don't have that skill in place or that feedback loop in place. The purpose of today's video is to shine a light on all of those things and give you an understanding of how you can actually refine different aspects of the movement to create a consistent pattern. Because one of the things that we're looking at is consistency is more important than perfection, okay? So even though we're talking about creating habits for long-term success, that doesn't mean that I want you to be squatting like Ed Coan or deadlifting like Jamal Browner. It doesn't matter if you aren't necessarily optimizing your technique right out of the gate, but the most important thing is creating a consistent pattern. And like I said a moment ago, it's the same with literally anything. If you're learning a language, an instrument, learning how to drive, learning the squat, they're all exactly the same and they follow the same rules. When it comes to creating schema within the brain, myelination of different patterns, we can go as geeky as we want with all of this, but ultimately we know that consistency is the driver behind the refining of any skill. So when we start to look at the higher level aspects of strength, we know that we can delineate between structure and function, or we can delineate between position versus intent. They're kind of similar things, okay? Position being what's going on the outside, how the movement actually takes place, things like joint angles, depth on a squat, everything like that. And then intent becomes a little bit more of a fine-tuning process and where we can actually individualize the execution of the movement. So we could talk about things like bracing, we can talk about, creating external torque, all of these things that you'll learn throughout the phase. If you're new to a movement, okay, you want to place the emphasis on the structure of the exercise, the position itself. Where does the bar touch on your chest when you're doing the bench press? What is the depth that you hit and how low do you squat? Where is the bar position during the deadlift? These are the things that have to be consistent right out of the gate and something that we continue to refine over time. If, however, you have a decent amount of experience, and as you can see there, it builds with experience, and you're someone that's on the program that's looking to reach that next level of performance, then you know that the consistency needs to come from how you execute that movement individually. Are you tightening your lats and taking the slack out of the bar when you perform the deadlift? Are you creating external torque at the shoulder and breathing posteriorly in between the kind of intrathoracic space when you're performing the bench press to create that pressure through the entire thoracic cavity? These are the things that we have to take control of and ultimately make sure they are consistent. So let's take the example for the purpose of today's video of the being new to a movement, structure and position, because you've got to remember that being new to a movement doesn't necessarily mean being new to training altogether. You could be an advanced lifter that's never performed a certain movement, in which case you're right back at the starting line when it comes to the skill acquisition side of things. We want to look at the setup, okay, and there's several different ways that we can identify this. Just to kind of give you an idea about what we would look at when we're in the squat, it could be broken down into the stance, the grip and the head position. There's several other things that we can focus on, but again, we're just looking at the structure of the individual here. So we can see that foot width, foot angle and foot pressure are all aspects of stance. The grip itself, again, width, hand pressure, what style have you got? Have you got thumbs over, a 3-finger grip? All of these different aspects will influence your technique, and it's things that you have to take into account to make sure they are consistent rep upon rep, set upon set. Head position, are you high, low, neutral? Do you have a direction of gaze that is preferable, and do you protract or retract your head position relative to mid-foot? Taking that into account, we also have to understand that loaded exercise is a system. It's not just you or the bar, it's you and the bar as one, as cheesy as that might sound. So you have to be aware of how your body position is consistent, but also the position of the weight itself, okay? A really simple example would be on the squat. The bar should be positioned on the shoulders at the same time every single time. This is one of the reasons why if you're a low bar squatter, I often recommend actually going going through the first phase of the program with a slightly higher bar position, because the mobility required to get into the low bar position is sometimes inconsistent based on things like postural discrepancies from the task that you've been performing within that particular day. And although the mobility section is there, sometimes it can create inconsistencies. So optimal positions aren't necessarily consistent ones. And this is why it might sound like this is all a very kind of systematic robotic method that we have in place, but ultimately a robotic routine creates efficiency. Two of my favorite quotes when it comes to this: life is simple, but we insist on making it complicated, okay? So I'm talking about all of these different aspects of technique, but ultimately we want to narrow it down to the most important aspect of your exercise execution and how it will influence the programming. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to take away. So taking that into account, okay, how do we know what we need to work on? I recommend that people start from the floor, okay? So you just literally imagine, as the photo kind of touches on, scanning from the floor up, going through different aspects of your body position, that you are aware of it, okay? So you're aware of where your foot position is, because a lot of the time, the discrepancies in technique simply come from not having an awareness of it. People will stand with the foot position slightly uneven and not even know that they're doing it, because that's the position that the body is comfortable in assuming. We just need to bring awareness to the body position and the bar position in general within the exercise. So tip number one, big rocks and central cues. All this means is we're looking for the aspects of the technique that tend to give us the highest return on investment. So like I said, keeping it completely simple, central cues are things that apply to the entirety of the system when you're performing that exercise. So a really simple example of that would be bracing, okay? Any movement that has axial loading, so any exercise that loads the spine, whether it's pressing overhead, whether it's doing a bent over row, whether it's doing a deadlift, any movement that requires that kind of core activation, if you bring your awareness and consistency to the ability to brace, it's going to stand you in good stead and give you a better kind of starting point when it comes to creating a consistent technique. The big rocks follows on from that in that, you know, when you're in the bench press, okay, focusing on the bar position and wrist position is going to be a little bit more important than foot position, because ultimately it has a greater knock-on effect for the movement. So use your initiative, try and identify the aspects of the exercise that are going to give you the highest return on investment where you choose to focus. So we kind of touched on this in the last video and review, okay? Even if you need to video every single set and analyze every single rep when you first start out, being able to identify the aspects of the technique where you tend to break and you don't necessarily create that consistent pattern is the most invaluable thing you can do when you're first starting out on that particular movement. So guys, that was just a quick video on how to create a consistent pattern within a movement. Again, just a quick summary. We're focusing primarily on creating consistency, not perfection, okay? We're looking at refining a movement with regards to the system, so the bar position or the position of the load and the individual. We're looking at creating a robotic routine purely as an aspect of internalizing an efficient pattern. We want to try and keep it as simple as possible, so we focus primarily on big rocks and central cues to net a larger return on investment when we are focusing on different aspects of that movement. As always, stay strong and I'll see you on the next one.